Hello, everybody. Welcome to Miss Glumm's Book Club, The Happy Teacher. We're on Stuart Little, Lesson 5, Chapter 5. So let's get going. Today, our major theme will be friendship again, adventure, family, and helpfulness. You will develop a definition for the word helpful. And to be successful, you will create a paragraph describing how you are helpful. The big question for chapter 5 is, what does it mean to be helpful? So we will read chapter 5, but before we do, let's review chapter 4. Stuart and the cat Snowbell discuss who is in better shape. Stuart grabs a string to a shade to prove he is strong and was rolled up in the shade. Snowbell took Stuart's hat and cane and placed it in front of the mouse hole. So remember, at the end of chapter 4, the cat did take the cane and the hat and placed them by the mouse hole. So when Mr. and Mrs. Little got up in the morning, that's where they thought that Stuart had gone. I'll read chapter 5. The chapter is called Rescued. So you can kind of predict what is going to happen. George rescued. George was in favor of ripping up the pantry floor. He ran and got his hammer, his screwdriver, and an ice pick. "I'll have this old floor up in double quick time," he said, inserting his screwdriver under the edge of the first board and giving a good, vigorous pry. "We will not rip up this floor till we have had a good search," announced Mr. Little. "That's final, George. You can put that hammer away where you got it." "Oh, all right," said George. "I see that nobody in this house cares about anything about Stuart but me." Mrs. Little began to cry. "My poor dear little son," she said. "I know he'll get wedged somewhere." "Just because you can't travel comfortably in a mouse hole doesn't mean that it isn't a perfectly suitable place for Stuart," said Mr. Little. "Just don't get yourself all worked up." "Maybe we ought to lower some food to him," suggested George. "That's what the state police did when a man got stuck in a cave." George darted into the kitchen and came back running with a dish of applesauce. "We can pour some of this in and it will run down to where he is." George spooned out a bit of applesauce and started to poke it into the hole. "Stop that!" bellowed Mr. Little. "George, will you kindly let me handle this situation? Put that applesauce away immediately." Mr. Little glared fiercely at George. "I was just trying to help my own brother," said George, shaking his head as he carried the sauce back to the kitchen. "Let's all call to Stuart," suggested Mrs. Little. "It is quite possible that the mouse hole branches and twists about, and that he has lost his way." "Very well," said Mr. Little. "I will count to 3. Then we will all call. Then we will all keep perfectly quiet for 3 seconds, listening for the answer." He took out his watch. Mr. and Mrs. Little and George got down on their hands and knees and put their mouths as close as possible to the mouse hole. And they all called, "Stuart!" And then they all kept perfectly still for 3 seconds. Stuart, from his cramped position inside the rolled up shade, heard them yelling in the pantry and called back, "Here I am." But he had such a weak voice and was so far inside the shade that the other members of the family did not hear his answering cry. "Again," said Mr. Little. 1, 2, 3. "Stuart!" It was no use. No answer was heard. Mrs. Little went up to her bedroom, lay down, and sobbed. Mr. Little went to the telephone and called up the Bureau of Missing Persons. But when the man asked for a description of Stuart and was told that he was only 2 inches high, he hung up in disgust. George, meantime, went down to the cellar and hunted around to see if he could find the other entrance to the mouse hole. So let me show you this picture of the 3 of them down the mouse hole while they're yelling. And it is your turn to do your independent reading, so I will let you go ahead and do that. All right, hopefully everybody had a chance to read the end of chapter 5. Let's do our independent work. So for today, number 1, describe what being helpful means to you. Number 2, in this chapter and other chapters, George tries to be helpful. Can you list 3 ways that George tries to be helpful in this chapter? And number 3, at the end of the chapter, why does George pull the shade down? And lastly, write a brief summary of chapter 5. Then, number 2, answer, are you helpful around your house? And if so, how are you helpful? And number 3, think of new words that you can make out of the name Stuart Little. Example, art. Let's see how many words that you can come up with. All right, I've had so much fun today during book club chapter 5, and I will see you all again next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.